Well, nearly a quarter of Canadians say they are eating less than they should due to the rising inflation.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has interrupted vital supply chains and driven up prices. The World Food Program warns that 50 million people are teetering on the edge of famine.
1 in 5 Canadians say they are completely out of money and there's no way they can handle a price increase for necessities.
I've seen my government take a turn for the worse on multiple dimensions. Our media is so subsidized by the government that anything that runs against government dictates, and I hate to say that about a country like Canada, is just minimally covered or not covered at all. I had no idea that the American truckers were flying Canadian flags. You'd think that'd be news in Canada, because isn't it news when Canada becomes interesting? And in fact, I know almost nothing about the truckers' convoy in the US to Washington, and I do try to follow the news. The Canadian truckers here, they were pushing back against what they regarded as unwarranted government overreach and intrusion into their private lives on the COVID front fundamentally. And I was a supporter of the truckers right from day one. I believe, like you do, that truckers and farmers and the men, particularly the men and the women who work on those frontline occupations, have a pragmatic wisdom that the intellectual types often don't. And I've also noted too that the intellectual socialist types really like the working class in principle, but they actually don't like the working class as such, because they tend not to hold the same utopian intellectual views that the globalists do. And so we saw that in spades in Canada, and I've seen my government take a turn for the worse on multiple dimensions in Canada that's jaw-dropping in its continuity and depth. And it's clearly the case that Canadians haven't woken up to that yet, although perhaps they're starting to. And a huge part of that is this appalling and unconscionable media collusion. And so now we see something similar happening in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, and we should let everyone know, and you have to listen to this, this is so important. You know, the Netherlands is the world's second biggest exporter of agricultural products. This little tiny postage stamp of a country that was scraped out of the ocean has managed to put itself together so that it can not only feed itself, but so that it's a major agricultural supplier worldwide. It's a phenomenal accomplishment. We should be so happy with the Dutch farmers that we can hardly stand ourselves. And instead, the courts in particular have mandated that the farmers be scuttled. And the government, their own government, has basically come out and said, well, because you guys pollute so much, we have to crack down on you, as well as reducing the speed limits of our cars, which is another appalling move. And we're sorry, but a lot of you are going to have to go out of business. But you know, to make an omelet, a few eggs have to be broken. And as the president of Greenpeace in the Netherlands said recently, well, we know we're not going to combat climate change, the climate change emergency, without inconveniencing a few people. And now there's 40,000 truckers in the Netherlands who are up in arms. And I believe 100,000 people have protested in Spain. And this is spreading into Germany and into the fishermen in the Netherlands as well, who are also being pressured by these utopian types. Well, partly because of the Ukraine conflict and the fact that we're wiping out a big chunk of the world's wheat supply and fertilizer supply, that we're going to be putting about 150 million people under intense food pressure, really starting this fall. I think that's when it's going to kick in. And my sense is, well, there's no way that can happen without mass migration pressure on Europe, maybe of a scale that makes the last migration crisis look like virtually nothing. And so am I being paranoid about that? You seem to be thinking along the same lines. And you said you've seen this coming for about 3 years.
I started warning in January of 2020, actually, and I've warned every day since. And I'm at this point, I warn about, a half a dozen times a day. So PAN4, let's talk about PAN4 first. Pandemic, famine, war, triangle of death. They always go together. If you get a big war, pandemic, or a big famine, you'll get the other two. You get one, you get the other two. It's three musketeers. And all of these things, any one of them creates the HOP, human osmotic pressure, right? So these things go together.
Because we disrupted the supply chains, and we have by no means fixed that in the least. There's a shortage. You can't get a car in Canada. You can't get a motorbike. You can't get a personal watercraft. You can't get paper and cardboard for books. There's a massive backlog and lineup for everything. I know that one container ship in 5 is now snared at a port. And so I know what happens when you put pressure on the supply chain. the people who suffer for that the most are the people at the bottom of the economic hierarchy. And so those are going to be people that are barely hanging on in developing countries, especially in North Africa. That would be my guess where this is going to have the biggest effects. And so, you know, if you show a 1% increase in unemployment, you get a 5% increase in psychiatric hospitalization. And that's because there's a lot of people who are just barely making ends meet. And then if you double the cost of necessities like energy or, let's say, fertilizer, or we could even put in food, then you're going to produce a tremendous amount of economic pressure on these people, tilt them into starvation. And so we've seen what's happened in Sri Lanka, which is just an absolute bloody, major, significant ongoing catastrophe. 21 million people in Sri Lanka. There's no way we're going to be able to feed them in any real sense for any long period of time. So all that eco movement forward on the Sri Lankan front is going to ensure that those poor starving people are going to eat every goddamn animal in that entire country to stave off starvation. And then they're going to burn everything for fuel, because what the hell else are they going to do? So this idea that we can make people poor, hungry, cold or hot by scaling back food production and disrupting energy supplies, and that's somehow going to save the planet, is as backwards a conception as any dimwit could possibly formulate.
Famine creates famine in the same way that war creates war and fire creates fire. Famine creates famine. So when we go into these initial phases of famine, you'll see immediately, obviously, price controls will start to be enforced. This happens every time. It's happening right now in Panama in the last 48 hours, right? Price controls, some gasoline and some other things.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of violence now in Panama. In fact, just minutes before you and I came on, I was talking with a friend in Panama about the current situation. That's how close I keep tabs on Panama, for various reasons. One is the Panama Canal. And so another thing is when people are hungry, that, as you know, within 48 hours, they're going to hit the streets, right? And they'll start robbing the stores. They'll start robbing the trucks and the trains and the boats. And so then supplies stop going. Governments always start taking food from the farmers. They, without exception, in my study over the years, the governments always go for the farmers, and like in Egypt recently, forcing the Egyptian farmers to sell to only approved warehouses, that sort of thing. So people start robbing from the farmers as well, right? And then the farmers say, hey, I'm either bankrupt or I'm not making any money. And so the farmers stop farming. So that's how you see we get into the second season of this, right? And so the famine creates more famine, just like fire creates fire. And then famine, let's say you have 20 million people that are hungry in Sri Lanka, and as their nutritional resources diminish, so too does their physical resilience. And now they're open to disease. Many of the people that die in famines actually die from things like, they call them famine fevers. One of those is typhus, another is relapsing fevers, cholera, which is not a famine fever, waterborne, of course. Anyway, the bottom line is, many of the people, if not most, who die during famines are actually from disease. And then this causes that human osmotic pressure, and these sorts of things often lead to more war, right? So it's a recursive sort of, the factors just keep, it's almost a fission reaction, right?
Obviously, Sri Lanka has collapsed entirely, and there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that a major part of the reason that Sri Lanka collapsed is because the globalist utopians gathered the reins of government in Sri Lanka, because it was actually developing at quite a rate. And as you said, it had a lot of food and not a bad general income level just a few years ago. So this wasn't a catastrophic country to begin with. It was a country on the move upward, and it was completely scuttled by these globalist plans.
Even Trump warned them about this years ago, love him or hate him. He was very clear about it. And we just had an explosion roughly a month ago at a Texas port, an LNG facility, which is critical, right? We were supplying liquid natural gas to Europe. This would have helped. You need this for the Haber-Bosch process to create many of the fertilizers, right? That natural gas is very important. Then we had an explosion and a pipeline explosion roughly 2 weeks ago in Texas. And then we just had another natural gas problem at a plant in Oklahoma. We've had 3, Oklahoma, 2 in Texas, right? Meanwhile, they're being shut off from Russia. And we've got a potential war brewing here, for instance, between Iran and Israel. Imagine where that could go on energy supplies.